All right. While we're waiting for people to come in, I see a lot of you are here already. Let me just start with some intros. So I'm speaking on my account here, Sebastien. I'm one of the co-founders of Paima Studios. Paima Studios is a Web3 engine. We help try and make building Web3 applications, especially related to gaming, as easy and as simple as possible. We've been around for a few years now. We support EVM as well as, of course, Cardano, and we just released the V2.2 of our platform, which now has native support for Cardano NFTs. So we're doing a whole bunch of cool stuff, and super happy to be here with Charles Hoskinson, who's one of the co-founders of Cardano. So maybe you want to give a quick introduction of yourself. I'm sure a lot of people here already know you, but as we wait for a few more people to join in.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Hoskinson. I'm the CEO of Input Output, and as Sebastien alluded to, I also help create Cardano alongside a few other ecosystems in the space. And lately, what I've been doing is kind of doing the circles and talking to all the different people building interesting things on and with Cardano. So yesterday, I was in the fluid space, and a little while ago, I was in a different dApp, and now I'm here with the Paima people. And my goal here is to listen and learn and see what people are doing and what's interesting. And also, what we're doing is setting up Intersect, and I'm trying to get as many projects in Cardano as possible to start collaborating, coordinating through Intersect. And there's so many different ways they can do that, either by joining or serving on committees or just participating in the open source project that is Cardano. Many of you know that the GitHub repos for Cardano have all moved over from Input Output and are actually now managed and operated by Intersect. And Intersect now controls the product backlog and Git access and all kinds of things. And so as we kind of move to completely decentralized governance and complete community control, it's becoming increasingly important that the community is aware of the different people building and doing things so they can make some priorities in the vision, the budget, and the roadmap about what features and capabilities Cardano should have. For example, should we have account abstraction? And if so, what does that mean? Or should we put a data availability primitives inside the system so that we can extend blocks and have like a kind of a proof chain that follows the ledger? Or what scalability solutions should we provide? We have some ideas on the IO side, but now the roadmap is completely in the hands of the community. So the community needs to see what people are doing, and then the hope is from that we can all come together and make some decisions about what we ought to prioritize and fund year by year. We kind of do this with Catalyst, but now it's kind of being taken to the next level because the whole treasury is unlocking. And with it, the capability of modifying the system parameters, hard forking the system, and Intersect is now there as a members-based organization with over 1,000 members and increasingly growing. In fact, this morning we were just in the civics committee meeting and talked about the interim constitution. So it's really remarkable to see all that come together. And I'm excited to be here to kind of see what you guys are doing and if there's anything we can do on our side to help or coordinate and anything that you need, it'd be great dialogue to have.
All right. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. So just to give a format for the space, everybody knows the format we're following. So first, we're going to do a few key points about gaming Web3. Then we're going to talk briefly about Paima Engine, and then we're going to be talking about the Paima Engine and Cardano and some of the synergies in the roadmap and the other projects related to Cardano space. So let's get started. So with gaming, as probably a lot of people have realized right now, this is one of the hottest kind of trends at the moment. If you look at the top coins by market cap, around 7% of them in the top 100 are gaming related projects. It's about a $20 billion industry by market cap at this point, and a lot of projects are coming out and growing really fast in the gaming space. Gaming has been a really great way to onboard new users. It's a different market segment than DeFi, and so it's an easier way to get people onboarded, especially if you're at an event, for example, and you pull out your phone and say, like, hey, like, check out Cardano, get a wallet set up, try it out. Realistically, at the event, they're probably not going to go on a DEX and start buying assets at the event. And a game is an easier way to get people to onboard and a more casual way. It's been great to onboard users as well as a great way to onboard developers. If you do a hackathon for blockchain, a lot of people have trouble committing to deploying any DeFi application they build to mainnet. Why? Because if you deploy to mainnet, you now carry any legal risk with that application you just deployed. Whereas for a hackathon, if you build a game for Cardano or another blockchain, you can deploy that game to mainnet, and there's less financial risk involved. And so it's easier to get developers on board through gaming. So gaming has really been pushing the industry forward from user adoption, from developer adoption, and projects like Paima Studios and what we're building are trying to help simplify that and help push user adoption forward. So that's kind of the core basics of gaming Web3. Our core thesis at Paima itself is that games by nature are fairly multimodal. What does that mean in practice? Like if you look at games right now, like you need, artists and music, and you need an engine, and then you need programmers, you need all these kinds of things to come together to build a game. It's a fairly comprehensive and complex process. And when you add Web3 into that, realistically, there's no single blockchain right now that provides everything you need for games. Why? Because for games, you need a lot of data. And you need ZK for private information, and then you need connections with NFTs, you need connections with DeFi. You need all these different, stacks that need to come together to build out an experience. And all you have, all these stacks need to wrangle together. You need to keep it simple enough that your average, developer in high school or university that's passionate about games can actually meaningfully put them together. So a whole bunch of things that need to come together to make gaming work. And so Paima Engine comes in to try and simplify that process. We allow you to leverage all these different stacks together in a single unified developer environment. So you don't have to go learn all these different tools. Paima Engine will manage all that for you. So that's kind of the background of key gaming points and Paima Engine, what we're trying to build. And we're not just building infrastructure, we're also a game studio as well. So we've actually published 4 games to mainnet already, and we have our 5th game, Tarochi, that's already on testnet, that's coming out. Tarochi is an on-chain RPG game, so it's a full RPG you can play with towns and monsters to catch and all this kind of stuff. The game is fully decentralized. There's no centralized server required at all to play the game. So anybody who's interested in contributing to Tarochi can come in and contribute new game rules or new things to the game, or just join in as a player. So it's really exciting to build, fully decentralized games and pushing that market and see where it goes. And we're happy to have Cardano wallet supported for this experience, as well as Cardano NFTs coming as well. Now, let's get more into the Q&A session now that we all have the background, which is, all right, so for Paima, we have Cardano wallet support. We now have Cardano NFT support. Where do we go from here? Of course, there's some other stuff we're working in parallel, like better interfaces for detecting if somebody's delegating to specific stake pools, or easier interfaces for detecting somebody's minting or burning NFTs. And we have a whole bunch of stuff on our side, but there's a few larger roadmap items within the Cardano ecosystem that we're super passionate about. And we'd love to, hear thoughts of Charles about how we can, work together on this. The first one I think is the most topical at the moment is Midnight. So Midnight, as some of you might know, is a ZK blockchain that's a partner chain to Cardano. ZK has been one of the hottest areas in gaming because it helps a lot with scalability. You can have multiple players playing together, then have a single proof of the result of the game, as well as you can have private state in your game as well through ZK. So I'd love to hear, Charles, your thoughts about Midnight for gaming. If this is something you folks are looking into, and your thoughts around use cases of ZK and gaming together.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points. So first off, with respect to the velocity of Midnight, currently where we're at is we're in the DevNet, and it was an invitation-only alpha. We had about 2,000 people apply, and about half of which were onboarded. And we got a huge amount of data and information to kind of get the rough edges out of the documentation, the faucet, the infrastructure for hosting a node. And also the programming language that was built with Midnight. It's called Compact, and it looks a lot from the outside like TypeScript, but then it has very special built-ins specifically to do zero-knowledge programming. The next iteration of Midnight will be an open beta, and our hope is to get that on schedule for release this quarter, and to roll a lot of people from the alpha into that open beta, and then start rolling hackathons. And I would really love to try something a little differently than what we did with Cardano, where we lead with development and every 2 weeks do a hackathon somewhere and try to bring a lot of people there. Now, as you've alluded to, one of the benchmarks that is very important is the GameFi space in general. We own Reflect, and they're building their own video games. And they also work with other large game studios like Gala Games. And there's been a lot of discussion about actually pulling together a group of like-minded game studios to kind of create a GameFi consortium and align it with some assets that we have. But in particular, zero knowledge is interesting because it allows you to have some primitives that make it really simple and easy to manage some very complex patterns. For example, if you're playing a game of poker, you're playing a game of blackjack, you have a notion of a public thing and a private thing. A public thing are the cards that you've revealed, and the private thing are the cards that have yet to be revealed, but their state has to be known somewhere inside the system. Well, generally speaking, what you have in a lot of these protocols is concept of a dealer or a trusted third party that can see the state of those things and then unblind them when they're relevant to the game flow. It's the same with your banking functions of being able to deposit chips and withdraw chips from the system. Well, when you have something like Midnight, it can act as the dealer, it can act as the banker, and you don't actually need a trusted third party. So anything that's a game of chance, a game of skill, anything that has a private state and a public state, it kind of falls inside that domain. And the good news is that when you have platforms like Midnight, what that does for you is it makes it easy to manage that because you don't have to be a cryptographer and an expert multi-party computation or an expert in very weird things to be able to do that securely. The system just kind of does that, and you write your smart contract like you would a TypeScript application. Now, another closely related concept is this concept of a hybrid application. And GameFi is a great example, and it's kind of the direction that you guys move and many others do, where your application doesn't ubiquitously live in just one location. And if you think about applications today, the reality is they're an aggregation of many, many different components of which the developer only writes a subset of them. So let's say you write a Node app, and so you're going to have something to interface through APIs to maybe Twitter's backend and to Facebook's backend, and maybe it interfaces with Google and it does something with them, and maybe you want some AI features, and so you're calling OpenAI's APIs. So you are the aggregation of a collection of services that bundle together. So when you look at the blockchain space as a whole, what's going to happen is people are going to build on one layer. Let's say they build on Ethereum or they build on Cardano, but then they start calling internal external services through well-defined interfaces that are tokenized, and they basically use those to upgrade and facilitate their app, whether that be an Oracle via like a chain link, or it be a hybrid app where it lives on Ethereum and Midnight or Cardano and Midnight. So for game development, that's kind of the direction and hope that we can see things materializing, where you have a collection of partner chains on Cardano, and some are really good, for example, with decentralized file storage and providing high available data. Some would be really good for management of private state and accounts and identity, and that's exactly what we constructed Midnight for, that data confidentiality concept. And then some may be really good to add some artificial intelligence capabilities to your video game. And you call all of these as services, and maybe your main application lives on Cardano, or it actually lives on a central server that you host yourself. That's kind of how we see the world moving, and we're investing very heavily as an ecosystem and trying to make sure that that actually is a rather straightforward process, where as a developer, the infrastructure doesn't get in your way. And part of that is asking what goes in, to borrow some Linux notions, what's in the user space versus the kernel space. So, part of that is asking, well, what platforms can be built on top of Cardano that are maintained independently of it, that are cross-chain and don't require soft or hard forks or changes to the formal specifications, and what capabilities actually need to be dragged into the guts of Cardano itself and require changes in the semantics of the system. In other words, a hard fork or a soft fork in order to work appropriately. And that's why these types of conversations are so valuable, because they can help steer the roadmap so that if people want to do certain things, they get better, faster, and cheaper, and they're universal and ubiquitous. But in general, it's just nice to have a platform that can provide privacy on demand, and have a platform that allows you to kind of reason about and think around, what do you want to keep secret and what do you need to be public, and how do you do that in a provably fair way, in a trustless way. And it's always helpful to have a use case in the back of your mind, like blackjack or poker or something like that, because it kind of primes the pump and it's obvious to people. You have a shuffled deck, but you haven't dealt it yet, so that's private state, but it has an order, and somebody has to maintain that and deal it. But then when you reveal it to the other players, then it becomes a public state, which is used to make decisions about asset flow and allocation. You can use that as kind of a cognitive pump to look at to all the other types of game experiences that people would produce, that where something has to stay private, but it still has to be somewhat deterministic in its view.
Awesome. Yeah. And for us on Paima Studios side, we're also super bullish on RPGs and MMOs and these kinds of more complex experiences as well. And we're trying to build these kinds of, large, complex worlds while maintaining full decentralization of the system. And this is, of course, a very, complex problem. But thanks to platforms like Mina, Midnight, these ZK platforms that are coming out, we think this is going to be very possible with stuff like ZK proofs. So, for example, you could have, if you play a Web2 MMO, usually you don't have a million people all in the same lobby, all playing together. Usually the game state is, for example, sharded into servers, and each server has like 1,000 players. And we can leverage some of these same ideas with the partner chain concept in Midnight to have different players playing in different partner chains or different instances of Midnight, and having the results aggregated into a single proof that is then posted down to Cardano or Midnight, the core chain. And then through Paima Engine, you can even have the results of these matches update real time to Cardano NFTs without necessarily having an Oracle do this for you. So you could be playing some MMO, having all the proofs settle through Midnight, and then having all your assets on JPEG Store, for example, update as you're playing the game, and facilitate trading those directly on Cardano, where you have the maximum liquidity and NFT marketplace volume. So some of the ideas that we're definitely working towards at our company, and so we're super interested in leveraging Midnight to not only bring these functionalities to life, but also probably be some of the first key applications to Midnight. Like, I think if you think about Midnight right now, like who's going to build on Midnight? Obviously, there's some really cool applications that'll come out, I'm sure, like private dexes and so on that take advantage of private functionality. But through gaming, bootstrapping liquidity is much less of a problem because you can, for example, through Paima, leverage Cardano assets directly through a game settling on Midnight. So you can leverage Cardano liquidity for your protocol, which makes like bootstrapping an ecosystem much easier and much faster. So super interested in Midnight integration ZK for Paima Engine.
Yeah, what's really cool about Midnight is that there's some stuff that's quite conservative, and there's some other stuff that's quite revolutionary. Like, we're really investing heavily into taking Halo 2 where it needs to go, integration of Plonk, which is some stuff that's been around for a while. But then Pluto Eris is a completely new curve structure, and because we're cryptographers by training, we actually have the skills internally and through our network to do a proper rigorous mathematical analysis of these new curves and get them implemented and used in the underlying products. Why? Because it's a lot easier to use them to convert into BLS or other proof structures. And so you can build much better rollups with them, and you can build much better recursive structures with them. So there's a lot of real cool bets that have gone into the proof stack of Midnight and how it handles zero knowledge that are very different from other systems like ZK Sync, which in some cases they just didn't have the in-house talent to be able to do some of the things that we're really good at. The other thing is it's a product that has tied together some really interesting technology from the industry. For example, we started from Parity Substrate as a basis, and there were a lot of great design decisions that were made there that are accelerators that are very complementary in many respects with what we did in Cardano. In other areas, it makes sense to kind of upgrade and augment. For example, bring the Cardano network stack, now that it's finished, into the Rust world and make it a part of Substrate. That's a much better network stack than the traditional stacks we see in the Ethereum and Polkadot world. And there's opportunities also to look at better consensus protocols that rely on the root of trust of Cardano, but are much more efficient once you've gone through that also guarantee fast finality, at the same time, which is a very different design than Ouroboros in its current instantiation. So there's a good mixture of old and new. And there's a good pragmatism inside the system. And there's a lot of great companies working on Midnight infrastructure already. Like, for example, Gawa, they're a military contractor, and they do a lot of work with DARPA and litany of other organizations. They've been working on Midnight now for the last 6 months, helping in a lot of the cryptographic engineering. They just have some of the best people in the world to do this very delicate, very precise code. And all those are working their way into the code stack, and they're being integrated on schedule. But games are definitely one of the best ways to kind of push the state of the art, and they also allow you to do some of the most experimental and interesting use cases. And frankly, if you get your game side right, then you can get mass adoption. And he's absolutely right when he says like RPGs and these things are just like huge drivers of innovation. If you look at Baldur's Gate 3 as just a kind of a case study, there's been millennia of human years spent playing that game collectively over the last 6 months. It's pretty remarkable. and they've sold, I think, around 40 million copies. So it works out to be like $1.2 billion in sales for this small game studio that's in Belgium, for an awesome RPG that's single player at the end of the day, mostly with limited multiplayer capabilities. So it's really cool to to see how much scale and how much passion you can get, and it does require this type of technology, especially when you start trying to expand it into a multiplayer state and have it be provably fair. A lot of people like player versus player. I'm a big fan of League of Legends and a lot of the Riot portfolio. And there are 5 players play against 5 players. And you again usually have to have a central server be the regulator of that because you want fair and provable rules. Otherwise, people could change their local state and violate the game system and as a Byzantine actor cheat to win. Well, your blockchain can actually be that regulator now, especially if you have privacy capabilities. That's what gives it the ability to do that without revealing the entire state of the system to everybody. But you still get assurances that cheating is not possible. So there's a very, very natural marriage from the tokenization, asset, and transactional side of gaming to the safety, security, and cheat prevention, hacking prevention side, to even things like proof of human and proof of freshness. So there are protocols. We wrote a paper years ago out of Virginia Commonwealth University called, I think, something like exactly proof of human, where you actually can prove with some degree of freshness for a period of time that the person at the keys is a human being. Well, those types of protocols could be implemented on top of Midnight and turned into a library, and they could be things that could be put into a roadmap, and then a game developer can actually put hooks in, and every so often when you're playing against an opponent, the game freezes and you have to perform a proof. And then once you perform that proof, then every player in knows that they're playing against an actual human. In an age of large language models and bots and these types of things, that's increasingly important, especially if you can't physically see the person on the other side. So this technology is very unique to our industry, and yet our industry has yet to fully realize it across the gaming industry. And given the size and scale of it, once it is, I think it's going to be one of the biggest areas of adoption and growth for cryptocurrencies as a whole. And Cardano and Midnight are best positioned to do that because there's just so many great people in our ecosystem, like DC Spark and building Paima, that's really changed things and grown things in just such a short period of time.
Yeah, thanks for that, and also thanks to everybody who's sharing the space and retweeting. Appreciate that a lot. Also, something I wanted to kind of dive deeper on that you mentioned is leveraging Cardano's root of trust. So, for people who don't know, Midnight is a partner chain for Cardano, which means that although it has its own stack, it still leverages some of Cardano's root of trust and Cardano stake pools for its operations. There is a framework called Mithril, which is written by IOG, Charles's company, that allows to basically leverage Cardano's root of trust to build overlay networks. So you could build this to say, okay, let's have, as long as 20% of the stake pools agree on the state of something, you can get a compact certificate that proves that the state is true. And you can leverage this for building partner chains, but you can leverage this for a lot of other infrastructure as well. And I think gaming can be one of the key users of Mithril. So, for example, a lot of games want systems like time lock encryption. This is say you want to be able to say, okay, I have a move I want to submit for my game, and I want to submit it to some server, but I don't want the result to be revealed until the 24-hour mark. This is very common in like strategy games. For example, everybody has 10 minutes to submit their move, or everybody has an entire day to submit their move, and at the end of the day, everybody's moves get revealed at the same time. So this is the concept of time lock encryption, where you lock something that's decrypted after a certain amount of time has passed. And the problem is that it's hard to have one game build like the time lock encryption system. You'd rather have some kind of shared infrastructure that any game can kind of leverage. And you could have these kinds of shared infrastructures run by Cardano stake pools. So as you play the game, you're locking your moves and submitting those to mempool hosted by the Cardano stake pool operators. And then these stake pools are the ones running this kind of time lock encryption committee to post the decryption keys at the right times. So I think like these kinds of use cases can also really boost Mithril adoption. Mithril, for those who don't know, is not like a in development technology per se. It's already running on testnet. I believe some people are already running out on mainnet as well. So it's fairly mature in development, and we're super interested to look into this for various gaming use cases. But I'd also love to hear, Charles, your thoughts on some of the early use cases for Mithril and how gaming can kind of fit into that as well.
Yeah, so Mithril fits into a broader category, kind of, I like to call it the meta blockchain space. And so blockchains, they contain this linked list of blocks and basically order history. And the problem is the more you do with them, the fatter that they get, and the more complex it gets to validate the entire state of the system and maintain the entire state of the system. So blockchains rely upon blockchains in order to preserve your personal inclusive accountability, yet the very nature of the artifact actually chips away at it over time because fewer and fewer people maintain the entire state of the system. So what's happening right now is a renaissance in the cryptocurrency space, talking about proofs about the system so that when you see transactions or events occur, they occur with a proof, and that proof is as good as possession of the entire state of the system, the DApp, the off-chain data, or the blockchain that you're dealing with. So Mithril is a very lightweight proof system that we developed and then built a second version of called ALBA with some people from Algorand. Leo Raisin was the big guy there. It was a great collaboration with him. He came to Scotland for 6 months and spent time with the team, and we learned an enormous amount together. But anyway, the long and the short is that those certificates can, within reason, prove certain things about the state of blockchain, the Cardano blockchain in its totality. And the first use cases are things like, oh, well, we want to have a light client and still enjoy relatively full node security. Or I want to have a full node, but bootstrap all the epochs in parallel, as opposed to bootstrapping them sequentially. So Daedalus that syncs in 30 minutes or something like that, but has the same assurance as if you had the full node. Now, that's kind of generation one, but then when you take it a step further, you kind of can go in two different directions. One is increasing the statements that you can make meaningful proofs about, so the robustness of your proof language. And the other direction is going in instead of making statements about the system as a whole, prove specific things about dApps or DeFi applications or cross-chain transactions and prove some details about them. Well, why is that important? Well, let's say that you're writing an application and it has to work cross-chain. You don't want a situation that the only way that that's secure is you're directly observing the state with a full node of each chain that's relevant, especially if you have like 10 or 15 blockchains involved or something like that. Imagine the resource requirement of something like that. So this is one of the research agendas of growing beyond just Mithril, is asking ourselves, what does the meta blockchain space look like, and what's the set of all things that we can prove? Now, this does require some discussion of extension of the Cardano blockchain. So Algorand has concepts like Algorand boxes, for example, and there are other ecosystems that have created special provisions where instead of having rigid block structures, you kind of have these hooks where you can plug external things into them, and that kind of follows that graph. And as a result, you can put your proofs inside those buckets. So there's a big conversation going on right now of, how do you continue to grow the people who participate in Mithril from the stake pool side to how do we actually start talking about block extensions and what other types of proofs do we want to see inside the system? Now, why this is relevant to game development is that if you have a very sophisticated proving system that has a programming language on top of it, then what you can do is you can use that programming language to call those proof systems kind of like a library, and you can use them to prove the properties of your game. And you get absolute certainty that people can't cheat or it's a fair game. For example, a lottery system. People buy a bunch of tickets and then there's a revelation of which one is the winner. Well, that's a commitment scheme. So you purchase your ticket, you commit it, and then there's an unblinding. The problem is if you implement that naively as a game developer, what if you have 5 or 10 million people participate at the same time? So are you going to create 5 or 10 million transactions for your weekly lottery and so the system and pay, transaction fees on all those things for these 88 kilobyte blocks? No. So ideally, you'd want to do that batching and aggregating with a proof system where they have one aggregate of that entire totality of the lottery, and everybody has enough material that they can verify the winners and losers, and there's a single transaction. So there's kind of like an instantiation transaction to set up the lottery, and then a payout of the winners as they unblind. But you don't actually have to store the entire state of the lottery and everybody's individual commitment of their lottery numbers on chain, or else you get 10 million transactions every week just from that one use case. So this is what we mean when we say we need to have like a strong meta blockchain game. And again, the good news is that is deeply connected to a field of computer science that is quite accessible to our research groups in the Cardano area. That's verified computation and programming language theory, something that's been thought about for a very long time. And there's some wonderful scientists that are floating around in the IO circles and the extended family at places like University of Edinburgh and CMU and Stanford, where this is all they've studied for decades. And so it puts us in a very uniquely good position to kind of think around as an ecosystem, what are the best bets that we need to take, and which ones have already kind of solidified a little bit in the standards world that we now need to import and bring into Cardano. And what's nice about Midnight is that it's already forcing that conversation real time very quickly. For example, Plutus V3 is adding BLS support to Cardano, which is a wonderful primitive if you're actually going to translate a lot of these proofs and bring them into the Cardano ecosystem. The Aiken team is already talking about how to connect such things to their language and make it easy for developers to use. And Midnight brings even significantly more sophisticated stack, which is basically going to be callable on demand for developers. And the language to access that is in TypeScript, which then allows people like Paima to build on top of that and make it even easier for game developers to use and more turnkey to use. And that abstraction can be sold not just to the Cardano ecosystem, but actually on a cross-blockchain basis. So potentially to Ethereum developers and Polkadot developers and Solana developers, which means they're bringing volume through the entire system. And so even though they stay in their own ecosystem, that creates use case and utility for the Cardano ecosystem as a whole. And it allows that platform not to have to take bets on like who's going to be a winner or a loser. So it's a very fertile area, and it's a very cool area. And it's one that I enjoy more than any other because it's like magic where it works. When you have a proof about something quite large and the proof grows logarithmically or it's constant to that thing, you could have a situation where something could be gargantuan, like terabytes to petabytes in size with lots of stuff going on. And you have this small thing that's kilobytes large, and you just show it and you're like, oh yeah, that's real and that happened. It just doesn't seem like it should work. It seems like it's a cheat code for reality. But somehow magic moon math gets us there, and we've been able as an ecosystem and the cryptocurrency ecosystem to figure out how to use these very remarkable mathematical primitives in this particular way. And where and when they work, they just simplify everything, and they massively reduce your operating cost as a game developer, so that you don't have to have a huge load and high transaction fees and other things to be able to service millions of users.
Yeah, and we're definitely super interested in using Mithril, and we're definitely going to be looking into this. But also, as you alluded to, like a lot of the goal of Paima Engine is to try and make all these applications as easy to use as possible, and as easy to develop as possible. And so to accomplish this, Paima Engine actually allows you to write your fully decentralized games all in TypeScript. So you don't have to go write any Solidity or write any icon. Paima comes with some icon smart contracts and some Slate smart contracts built in that you can just leverage. And we allow developers to just write a state machine. We turn that state machine into an app-specific layer 2 for their application. And we already have stuff like account abstraction built in that supports Cardano wallets and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so all these kinds of frameworks coming out to leverage Mithril and Icon and all these other platforms with TypeScript just keep making Paima Engine much easier to use. And we have a lot of customization hooks. So if there's a special Icon smart contract or a special Cardano metadata you want to get included inside your game, Paima Engine has all the hooks required for you to come in and hook that in and build out your cool experience. But another cool technology that I think will kind of put into hyperdrive is Marlowe. So as I mentioned, we have hooks for you to come in and add in your own Solidity smart contract or your own Icon smart contract into your game. But realistically, a lot of game developers are not Icon developers, and they're not Solidity developers. If you ask them to write a contract, most likely they're going to get it wrong, or it's going to be outsourced and significantly increase the cost of their game development. And one really cool tool to come in and solve this is Marlowe, which is a way to write smart contracts that are compatible with Cardano with a visual no-code editor. So you can drag and drop boxes together. And this makes doing stuff like betting protocols. We can have like players put in money and then Oracle comes in and pays the winner of the match. Makes building these kinds of use cases super, super easy. And with Marlowe, when you write your application like this, not only do you get a contract, you also get a TypeScript SDK for it generated for you, which makes it super easy to compose with Paima Engine. So we're currently in talks with the Marlowe team to see how we can integrate Marlowe for these kinds of gaming and Web3 use cases with Paima Engine. But we'd love to hear from Charles about Marlowe and the progress on that front.
Yeah, so Marlowe's at an inflection point, and it's a great example of what happens when you get to 1.0 and what does the community want to do with it. So over this PI cycle, what we're doing is we're getting everything tidied up, cleaned up, getting it ready to survive Conway, and then we're going to work with Intersect and the community as a whole, and they're going to kind of make a decision what that long-term roadmap is going to look like. We built Marlowe for two reasons. One, we wanted to have a Turing incomplete, really turnkey, easy way to model financial transactions and flow, because that business logic is so critical to the vast majority of blockchain applications, and it's oftentimes where you screw up and where the hacks happen, where somebody who shouldn't be able to withdraw money or have an escalation privilege and spend money somehow does because of a reentrancy bug or some flaw in the code, and you can't discover it because these programs get too complicated. By having it as a Turing incomplete language, you can use a SAT solver, and you're actually able to prove each execution thread is not going to create a problematic event. So by paradoxically making it simpler, you can actually build much more complex modular things, and those things are very secure. That was one dimension. The other dimension is we wanted to show how to do a domain-specific language on top of Cardano. Because in practice, what's going to happen is you're going to have lots of DSLs as things become more complicated. So, for example, if you're doing a lot of database programming, you could, yes, try to figure out, gosh, how do I fill every cell in this database? Or you can learn SQL. And it basically has these built-in primitives to allow ACID compliance to work. And it's built from the ground up for relational databases. And it's very simple to program a very complex thing, regardless of what you're storing and how many tables you have. Or if you want to do presentation, you have these presentation languages like CSS and HTML. And yeah, technically speaking, in C++, you could kind of figure out how to hand code and write something for that. But you need, it's much, much easier to use a domain-specific language for that. So what we wanted to do is build one domain-specific language and use it as a case study for the Cardano ecosystem as a whole for how people would go about that. So I think mission accomplished, and it's going to be a lot of fun to see what Intersect does with that 1.0 and where they take it. And also, if there's going to be a goal to create more DSLs, or is the goal to make the existing general purpose programming languages a little stronger? From IO's viewpoint, in the coming months and years, there's going to be a big focus on improving the efficiency of UPC, Untyped Plutus Core, and there's going to be a we lead and we follow type strategy. So where we lead is on certification in Plutus TX, which is the surface language and the surface tooling for Plutus, and making that a high assurance programming language so that you can write really, really, really mission critical applications like bridges and other things where they traditionally get hacked all the time and create catastrophic harm to an ecosystem when they fail. Then there's two we'd like to follow in. One, we'd like to actually commit full-time engineers to be part of the ICANN open source project and basically just follow their lead. So whatever their roadmap happens to be, we're contributing development resources to take care of that. And then on the other side, we really need a web-native, web-oriented language that most everyday developers are familiar with for that type of scripting. So it'd be very nice to leverage what was one of Catalyst's proposals, a Plutus TypeScript project, but also Compact was designed to look a lot like TypeScript as well, and kind of discuss around how we can support and put some full-time engineers there. That's where I'd like to spend a big chunk of our time. And then what I'd like to do is see an ecosystem of DSLs start materializing based upon whether they get adopted or not. So Marlowe is kind of at that inflection point where the community has to decide what they want to do with it and whether to adopt it. And if it gets pulled in, it's very easy through Intersect for Marlowe to continue growing in versions and doing things. But already as a version 1, as we get to that, it's already capable of doing the things that it was intended to do. And it's going to be useful for quite some time for that use case. But then there's a question of how much further you want to go. For example, there were some discussions about could Marlowe be ported to other ecosystems, like Ethereum, for example, and become kind of a lingua franca for financial transaction modeling inside the ecosystem, or not only our ecosystem, but multiple ecosystems. Another example would be improving the tooling around Marlowe and extending it so that AI has an easier time reasoning and building these because it's a Turing-incomplete language. LLMs actually can really do some great work and could potentially pull in some of these things like Copilot in via Visual Studio or other frameworks into the Marlowe dev workflow, and you kind of co-develop a Marlowe contract with AI. So these are some of the discussions that will be in the budget and the roadmap committees that intersect. And it's an example of a project where you kind of get it to a stopping point and you ask. It's much the same with Hydra as Hydra approaches version 1. There's probably another, I'd say, 6 to 9 months of hardcore work for incremental commit and decommit and a lot of use cases and applications, but there's a very fertile ecosystem that is formed around a Hydra and even community implementations that are starting to form around it. But then there's some open questions of, well, where do we go from there? Because the original paper has been implemented. Well, you can do a head-to-head protocol, you can do head-to-tail, and you could do all kinds of optimizations to make it super efficient payment channels. You can pull quantum computing artifacts in, like with the one-shot signatures concept, and you can do really amazing things there. But the community really needs to discuss, okay, what are the priorities after we get past 1.0? So I tend to look at it in that dimension. And then I say, okay, what is the main effort that we need to do as core infrastructure providers? Well, there we have to make sure we have different paths for developers. And so a general purpose programming language like Icon makes a lot of sense for your everyday developer who wants to write real applications. And it looks a lot like Rust. And then you have something for your native web developer who wants to embed these types of things in those types of experiences. So that needs to look a lot like a TypeScript. And then you have something for a hardcore engineer, somebody who's been doing this for a long time, who's not tasked with adoption. He's not trying to say, God, how do I get this out in market as soon as possible? He's more worried about risk. If you're Microsoft, you're not really thinking about adoption. You have 3 billion customers. You just want to make sure your 3 billion customers aren't defrauded or hacked or they lose their data. So your key driver is not rapid prototyping and dev productivity. Your key driver is safety and assurance. So to me, it's very important we have those 3 pipelines, and then we have the ability to extend those pipelines with DSLs. And then the community can kind of decide which DSLs are useful and they like, and other DSLs kind of fade away over time. Another example of a DSL that's horizontal is the idea of a legal DSL. The Ethereum community has been exploring this very closely with a concept called open law, where you actually can write in a domain-specific language something that has a dual purpose. It acts as a legal contract that could be enforceable in a court of law, but then also it is machine understandable, so a smart contract can operate on that. So, if you're a game developer, going back to that, how do people sign your end user license agreement? How do people agree to abide by the arbitration of the game, especially if it's like a game of chance with value flows like gambling or these types of things? How do you get legal contracts for the asset transfers? Like when you mince an NFT, how do you make sure that people understand maybe they have a royalty-free access to that NFT, but they don't own the underlying intellectual property? You could write this by hand, or you can even get a lawyer to do that. You have a digital signature, or maybe we have a legal DSL that's capable of doing these things. So the point of Marlowe was to open up that capability and show how we could do that in the Cardano ecosystem in general. And then the community is going to have to decide, how aggressive it wants to be on the DSL side of things. It's the same when you look at the graph. It's the same when you look at any business domain. You can always write a DSL to represent these things. And Marlowe was really a special project for 5 years to figure out how to do that in an optimal way in the finance world.
Yeah, and I've been looking at the Marlowe videos you folks have been putting on YouTube, and they're really good. And I'm super excited about seeing how we can integrate this to make developing some of these core contracts as easy as possible, so that developers using Paima can, of course, go down to Icon and Solidity if they want to. But if they want to just write something easy, they have tools like Marlowe or some of these other DSLs you're talking about to just get something out the door as fast and as safely as possible. Speaking of which, if you are interested in this kind of work we're doing, be sure to follow the Paima Studios account. It's up here as one of the speakers, and we'll be keeping the community up to date about all this work that we're doing to integrate all this kind of technology. Now, one thing you mentioned as well, Charles, is the concept of hydra and state channels, and I know you folks are also working on a sidechain toolkit as like an SDK as well. And from our side of Paima Studios, our main focus is to try and leverage the Cardano layer 1 and Ethereum layer 1 and these kinds of well-known roots of trust as much as possible with our solution, and that's why we're investing so much time into things like ZK and to things like Cardano IT support and all these other kinds of systems we're building. But there are times when there is no other option but to go out and build a sidechain or another kind of system for your application. And so an example of that was the Snack game that recently came out that is built using Paima Engine and leverages Milkmeta for that. And you can still play with your Cardano wallets. You never have to download EVM wallets. And we built that through our wrapped smart contract support for Milkmeta that allows calling EVM smart contracts directly from Cardano wallets. So from a Cardano user perspective, still feels like a native Cardano experience. You're using your Nami wallet or Lace or whatever it may be. And you never have to leave that wallet to still connect with EVM dApps. And we've been spending a lot of time on account abstraction to enable this, not just on the Milkmeta side and EVM side, but also on Paima Engine side. So the Paima Engine also supports using these kinds of cross-chain games all with the same Cardano wallet. So I'd love to hear what you folks have been working on the kind of sidechain side, as well as you mentioned Hydra as well. And you also mentioned that in the next hard fork for Cardano, there's the BLS precompiles and some bitwise primitive precompiles that should be added that help making these kinds of other networks that connect into Cardano. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that as well.
That's a great question, and the sidechains framework is quite evolved because it's nice to start from somewhere. And the Polkadot community did such a great job with Parity Substrate, and I don't think they get enough credit. They're engineers at heart, and they're very smart people, and they've always been very easy to talk to and work with. And we've had a frenemy style relationship where we're rivals from a perspective of ecosystems at times, but we're friends in that they're real engineers, and real engineers like real engineers. It's very easy to talk to them in those circles. So we started with Substrate, and we started talking around what makes a really good framework, and we're learning as we go because we did Mamba, and we also were doing Midnight. And in the process of doing that, we're learning an enormous amount of stuff about what, in addition to where Substrate started, we need to add to have a good framework for a partner chain. And so right now where the team is at is that they're adding layer after layer of new features and functionality. And at the end of the day, hundreds of thousands of new lines of code will be written. So it would be unfair to say the partner chain framework is Substrate. It's inspired by it, but it's a very different product. It has different notion of consensus. It has a different notion of a network stack. It has slightly different interfaces, although it does have a notion of palettes and these types of things. And one of the hallmarks is this concept of multi-resource consensus. So people say, are they layer twos or these side chains? What are they? Well, they're kind of both, because you have a situation where you're using multiple consensus algorithms at the same time. Some that are exogenous to your partner chain, meaning they come from a different system, in this case, Cardano's root of trust through the SPOs. But then you also have the ability to graft on your own consensus algorithms that are related to your business logic. Well, why would you do that? Well, let's say you're Iagon, or let's say you're some storage service. Wouldn't you like to have some proof of storage or proof of space or proof of availability and incentivize that at the consensus level so that you actually create a mechanism where people mine with hard drives? So by having consensus in your system, you end up getting petabytes of available storage for your system, kind of like what Filecoin is thinking about in that direction they've been going. Well, that's exactly right. But wouldn't it be nice to hybridize that with Ouroboros or a BFT protocol or other such things? Maybe when you're launching a system, the system has regulatory requirements behind it where you have to maintain some degree of control over that. For example, when you look at things like World Mobile, they have regulation and licenses for Spectrum. And unfortunately, the ITU and governments do not recognize blockchain. So you can't have a situation where a blockchain is able to license its own Spectrum. So there's, until law evolves, this idea of a hybrid where you have some decentralized components of the ecosystem, but then you have some other components that do require some custodians. So it's not quite Web3. It's kind of still living that Web 2.5. Well, if that's the case, maybe you want to layer a permission protocol with a permissionless protocol. So they kind of keep each other in check, but you still, as the operator, have some say over how the system evolves, and then you have a path to federation by having multiple operators federate at that level. So you create a heterogeneous management structure. So this is really kind of the notion of where we're going with partner chains is creating a framework where you have this flexibility, you have a lot of modularity, so you can put your own network and transaction logic in, and you then also can decide how much you want to borrow from Cardano and how much you want to build bespoke. The other side of it is the two-token model. This is something that we've been innovating with Midnight, where you have one token live on Cardano as a Cardano native asset, and another token live on the partner chain as the fuel of the partner chain. Now, the reason you separate these two is that you separate governance and ownership and oversight from consumption, which means you can have different monetary policies for your governance and oversight from your consumption. And that means you can start working around trying to create predictable pricing. Because when you have a partner chain, it's really a service layer. You're offering something, you're selling something, whether it be privacy or storage or a decentralized social network or a decentralized LLM or whatever that business domain happens to be. Well, if you're selling something, you don't want a situation where speculation rapidly changes the cost of the offering of that service that you're selling. Or otherwise, how will you compete with traditional Web 2 ventures? So you need to have some mechanism where you can create predictability of the service offering for all parties involved. And by having a buy token model, it allows you to do that. And again, having a framework that kind of makes that a little easier for you to do, it really helps everybody along, and it makes it pretty uniform and standard for people to experiment and launch these things. So my definition of success is to have a great framework that's an open source project and it's got a lot of cool batteries included stuff, and to see dozens of partner chains materialize, and for then those partner chains to sell those services to Cardano applications and to the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem and sell them to Ethereum applications and Polkadot applications. And our success is their success, because ultimately it brings a lot of transaction volume and use and utility into the Cardano ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, I got right on my main account, so I'm speaking now on the Paima Studios account. So that's still me, still Sebastien. Thanks for that. Yeah, super excited about leveraging these kinds of frameworks as well. And I think for us, Milkamita has been a great way to kind of build more kind of experiences that are more flexible than what you get on the Cardano Layer 1, while still retain the Cardano user base and still connecting everything together. And super excited for the next generation that through this sidechain toolkit SDK that you folks are building to try and build cooler experiences. Now, another key point to mention, Paima Engine is actually on GitHub. It's fully available for anybody to use. So as Charles mentioned, one of the key things that everybody here is trying to build is, these systems that anybody can come in and contribute and build on top of these systems. And we're no different. So if you look at the pinned post right now, you can see the Paima GitHub org. If you're a developer and you've loved everything you heard in the space and want to contribute, feel free to follow and start the GitHub account, join our Discord, and all that kind of good stuff to get involved in the development as well. So lastly, before we wrap up the space, I do know that, Charles, of course, you are working on a few different gaming endeavors, including Reflex, and you've talked about Legends of Valor and these guys have other kinds of initiatives you have going on. So maybe to wrap up the space, you can talk about some of the work that you're doing in this space, and then we can end on there.
Yeah, I love games, and I love game development. I kind of break our game portfolio into three different buckets. So one bucket is the bucket of modernizing and taking existing pieces of IP and bringing them into the Web3 world and trying to find novel and new ways of doing that. So, for example, Reflect, you look at their game portfolio, they have things like Girl Fighter, and they actually bought the IP for Descent, which is an old interplay game, and people really love that game. I kind of grew up with it. I know a lot of people did. And so that's one dimension of the portfolio. So you're not inventing completely new game mechanics. You're taking nostalgic old ones and you're making them accessible now to a new generation of people. The second thing I like is I'm a huge fan of computer RPGs, and I think there's a huge space for your Gods of War and your Baldur's Gateses and Skyrims and other things, these big open world RPGs. That's where Legends of Valor fits as a piece of IP, but there are other ideas that we have as well. And then the third thing I really love are experimental games where the point of the game is actually to talk around broad concepts that are not terribly accessible to everyday people. So, for example, 5D chess is a super good example of that, where you actually literally have a chess where you can send pieces back in time to earlier states of the game, and then you can play multiple games at the same time in different time frames. So it's just so trippy when you see it. Another example would be 4D Miner, where it's actually an enumeration of Minecraft in a four-dimensional world. And, like, how does that work? It's really crazy when you take a look at that. Mainstream examples of experimental games are things like Portal, where, people played that and suddenly you now have this additional dimension, this portal, where it's not just a three-dimensional space. You can kind of fold space with portals, and you could create really unique and exciting puzzles there. And so our game portfolio kind of fits into one of those three buckets. Reflect focuses a lot on the first bucket, the coalitions, the partnerships, the IP resurrection, because that's a little safer and it's a little easier to reason around. And also, from a game developer viewpoint, there's a lot of developers who grew up in the 90s and 2000s, and they're really frustrated because they never got to fully realize the vision of the IP that they created at Interplay or BioWare or these other places. So it's really easy to partner with those guys because you get to say, hey, would you like a do-over? And they say, yeah, of course. Well, I'd love to go back and redo this thing that I did 20 years ago and make it a lot better and finish some unfinished business. And then through partnerships and coalitions, they then try to really focus on the business model of Web3 gaming. What I'm going to do is set up a bespoke entity to focus on the CRPG side. And that's the entity that's going to create Legends of Valor. I haven't done that yet because we got 6 companies we have right now that we're spinning out. So we're way, way too busy. And Cardano obviously takes priority. But, somewhere in the horizon, like 3 to 5 years, I think we'll be able to get that started. And then the experimental games, what I try to do is I try to find some really cool ones and just reach out to them and say, hey, is there some way we can create a relationship and we can bring this IP into our broader ecosystem? Because you can actually look at the blockchain, for example, as additional spatial or temporal dimension. You can look at the blockchain as an additional actor, and it would be really cool to actually see where that can go and what you can do. So that's mostly my interest. I grew up with computer games. I grew up with old school Nintendo and Super Nintendo. I never had an N64. I pivoted from the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis to the computer games and never looked back. But it's good to actually be able to produce some IP. And my brother, he's a doctor, but he also, for a long time, actually ran a Nintendo repair company called Nintendo Repair Hut. And he got so into it, he actually was doing homebrew Nintendo games. He custom fabricated with partners in China casings. Like, remember the old Nintendo lids used to break all the time? So he actually had injection molds created to replace and repair those, or game cartridges, these types of things. So he's a huge fan of that retro homebrew game market, which is still quite strong. And we even started buying some of the old Nintendo games, their IP. Like, we own Crystal Miner, for example, which is a game we played as kids, like every day. It was such a fun game. It'd be a lot of fun to bring that in. And I'll be honest with you, the perfect place to bring that in would be in the browser. And it would be a lot of fun to actually use Paima with that and have an NFT layer and other such things and distribute it as a free game and have kind of a different model for that. So we're definitely going to be consumers in some fashion of the things that you guys do, and then you're definitely consumers of some of the things that we do. And I encourage everybody who's in the space to join Intersect and to work with Intersect where and when you can, because it's where all those discussions are happening and how everybody's kind of pulling together, and we're together trying to figure out one roadmap to make the Cardano ecosystem the best ecosystem in the world to build on, and the best ecosystem to do business in.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really awesome. And so, as a reminder for anybody who wants to follow along, you can follow the Paima Studios Twitter account here. You can find our GitHub above if you want to contribute to the code, and you can join the Discord if you want to be involved in the community. We also have our own RPG game called Tarochi that we're hoping to get released on mainnet on February 15th. So if you'd like to try out these decentralized games, see what the user experience is like, potentially even contribute to the game yourself, because it'll all be on GitHub, definitely join the community. This is a great time to get involved in Paima and decentralized gaming and on-chain gaming as well. So thanks everybody for coming out to our space, and definitely stay in touch.
Thanks, everybody.